This is part 2 of our story about how St. John Bosco rebuked the King of Italy for allowing monastic suppression laws. And if you haven't seen part 1 yet, just click on the card I put at the top of the screen. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. The king opened St. John Bosco's letter, and after a quick perusal exclaimed, "I thought so. He's always like that. Bring the letter back, guard it, and give it to me when I return." He set off, but after taking a few steps he turned back and called to the messenger saying, "Give that letter to me." Putting it in his bag, he continued his journey. The king was distraught about Don Bosco's letter, all the more so because he was grieving the death of his infant son. Or at least that's what Don Caliero heard from Marquis Fossati, who had seen Don Bosco's letter open on the king's coffee table. Having returned to Turin, the sovereign asked some ministers to read Don Bosco's letter. "Look at what Don Bosco says. You tell me now whether I should sign the law." Unfortunately, we don't know how those gentlemen responded, but on May 28, 1855, the Chamber of Deputies approved the bill by 95 votes to 23, and it had 5 main provisions. 1. The suppression of convents who were not involved in preaching, education, or care of the sick. 2. The suppression of positions and colleges in towns with fewer than 20,000 inhabitants. 3. The creation of a church treasury. 4. Pensions to be awarded to religious men and women. And 5. A special tax to be levied on church institutions that were not suppressed. When the bill was presented to the king for his signature, he replied, "Let me think about this." The ministers, aware of the king's hesitancy and unwillingness to sign the bill, proposed that he seek the advice of trusted court theologians. We don't know whether they suggested this on their own initiative or at his prompting, but the king agreed. At this time, he was so determined to do what was right that if those theologians had given him the correct advice, he would have either never signed the law or would at least have deferred it. 4 court theologians, doctors of canon law of the University of Turin and disciples of St. John Neumann, gathered in the royal palace. Victor Emmanuel put the matter before them and gave them Don Bosco's letters to read, adding that he wanted them back. Then, in order not to interfere with their freedom of discussion, he withdrew to a nearby room, nervously waiting for their reply. The theologians didn't take long to form an opinion. They told the king, "Your Majesty, don't be frightened by Don Bosco's letters. The age of prophecies is past. Ignore his dire predictions and threats. As for the law concerning monasteries and convents, it's an accepted principle that the authority which creates a thing can also do away with it. It is the state that grants the privilege of forming a moral body, and therefore it is also within the power of the state to withdraw such privileges with all its implications." The king asked, "So, in good conscience, can I sign this law?" "Certainly," they replied. So on that very day, May 29, 1855, the king signed it. It affected 35 religious orders, 334 religious houses, and 5,406 people. At the same time, a royal decree closed the Academy of Superga, which had been left without students after Don Audicio was expelled. The large revenues accumulated thanks to another decree were spent on offering temporary and permanent allowances to benefit defrocked priests and certain theologians who served the national government, none of which were distinguished in their piety. These laws brought untold anguish to the institutions of the church, especially to poor religious women. Many priests were also prosecuted for fulfilling their duty in administering the sacraments. This truly was not about revenue for the state, but a smashing of Catholic Church in Italy by Masonic, secular, and atheistic forces. The day after the infamous opinion given by the king's theologians, there was a canon from a provincial town who encountered Don Bosco at the Rondò in Valdocco. Don Bosco greeted him. The canon returned the greeting and asked, "Are you Don Bosco?" "Yes." "Are you the one who wrote those insolent letters to the king?" the canon demanded. "Yes, it is I," Don Bosco replied, "but they were not insolent. A faithful subject must write to his king to warn him about a bad step he is about to take. The canon raged on, "And was it you, then, who dared to impose your opinions and to dictate laws when you should instead obey? I am amazed that you were so brazen." "Did the king follow my advice?" Don Bosco asked. "The sovereign was within his rights," the canon said. "It was a privilege of the crown." "Did you advise the king of his right?" "Absolutely," the canon replied. "Did you advise him to sign?" Don Bosco asked. "Without a doubt." Don Bosco said, "Pardon me, but before I go on, I would like to ask you a question. Did you celebrate Holy Mass this morning?" The canon protested. "That has nothing to do with how I must reproach you." "Please," Don Bosco insisted. "Did you celebrate Mass this morning, or did you not?" The canon answered, "Yes, I did celebrate. Why do you ask?" "Before celebrating, did you go to confession?" Don Bosco asked. "What a question! Why?" asked the canon. Don Bosco scolded him. "How could you dare to approach the sacred table without asking the Lord's forgiveness for the unjust advice given to the king? Without repairing as much damage as you could, damage that the church has received through your fault?" The canon was offended by Don Bosco's denunciation. As his excuse, he offered all the arguments that the University of Turin spread without reproach, that the king possessed full supremacy concerning certain rights that the church claimed for itself. Don Bosco rebutted all those false propositions one by one and left the canon confused and stunned. The canon eventually went away, very disgusted with Don Bosco, but he soon became his friend and distinguished benefactor, and he remained as such until his death. This account shows how the errors that certain professors taught university students had poison that could obscure the most obvious truths, and this particular canon swallowed the liberal arguments of the day hook, line, and sinker. Thank God St. John Bosco converted him. And if you'd like to hear about how he converted an angry sword-wielding general who nearly attacked him as revenge for how he had rebuked the king, please subscribe and come back Friday to hear the final part of this series. In the meantime, you might check out this playlist I've put up about Don Bosco's miracles. Thank you all so much for watching. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.